So at 17 years old, my grandmother inherited the Texaco fortune. She's on the front page of the New York Times, and she was listed as the wealthiest woman in America. And she was only 17. Had to hire security, and she was getting death threats. And then they're going through the Great Depression, and so really a complex thing. And
welcome to Everyone's Talking Money, where we get brutally honest about money, mindset, and making life richer. Let me paint a picture for you. You're 18 years old. You get an email that unlocks hundreds of thousands of dollars. You didn't earn it. You didn't even ask for it, but now it's yours. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, what if it wasn't? Or how about this? You're 17 years old and you are named the richest woman in America. That's exactly what happened to Chase's great-grandmother. Today's conversation is going to challenge every assumption you've ever had about wealth, because we're not talking about how to get rich. We're talking about what happens when you already are. I'm joined by Chase Collins, a fifth-generation inheritor who was handed a trust fund, but also inherited guilt, identity confusion, emotional silence, and some pretty intense family dynamics. He's the author of Trust Your Trust Fund and founder of the Trust Fund Coach. And he's opening up in a way that very few people ever do. We're talking money wounds that don't come from lack, but come from excess. We're talking about losing yourself in wealth, rebuilding your worth outside of a balance sheet, and learning how to use your money as a tool, not as a trap. This isn't a conversation you hear every day, but it's pretty interesting. Whether you've inherited wealth, expect to one day, or just want to better understand the emotions behind money, this episode is going to shift something in you. Let's get into it. Chase, you're incredibly open about the emotional weight of inherited wealth, the guilt, the stigma, the isolation. Can you take us back to the moment when you realized this money isn't solving my problems, and in fact, it might actually be making things harder?
yeah, absolutely. I would say it was really when I started to receive my inheritance that I started to notice common themes and challenges that I watched my father and my uncle go through, along with many other family members. And it was kind of in this moment that I realized that these similar challenges and with the same circumstance, and not really having any drive or motivation to do anything because my bills were paid, and just having too much time, too much freedom, and living in New York City, which is very expensive. So that was kind of the moment I started to, connect all the dots and realize that there really is common themes and threads within inherited wealth. And I kind of talk about it as hidden challenges or hidden curses of inherited wealth.
So you mentioned your father, your uncle, your other family members. So this isn't as if a family member passed away and then you received this money. Your work is called Trust Your Trust Fund. So this is family wealth that is, once you've become a certain age, you receive it. Is that how the nuts and bolts of it go?
Yeah, essentially. So I'm a fifth generation inheritor. So my dad was fourth. He passed away in 2009 when I was 11. So I was quite young. And so I didn't start to receive my inheritance at 11. And I really had no concept of money, or, there was really no conversation about money before then. But after he passed away, it kind of came to my awareness that I had a trust fund, and I watched my mom be a single mom and struggle, live paycheck to paycheck. So it was, there's a part of my book that's both sides of the coin, where I kind of got to experience both, paycheck to paycheck, struggling and stressed about money, and then also the abundance and, having wealth and knowing I have a trust fund, but having a very brief understanding of what that meant. And my grandma had seen how people before me, cousins older than me, and my dad's generation had struggled and didn't do super well with inheritance. So she actually structured me and my siblings, who are the youngest of this generation, she structured our trust funds to be handed out to us in distributions until we're 35, which, is the greatest blessing. But so yes, when I turned 18 and 21, is really when I started to experience a lot of these challenges and difficulties.
I'm so sorry you lost your father at such a young age. Your father passes away, and you knew you had a trust fund. I'm sure at 11, you didn't know how much was in it or even
Hmm.
necessarily what it was exactly, but I'm sure your mom had some idea. But
Hmm.
what an odd dynamic of your mom's now single mom, paycheck to paycheck, and she knows my children have this gobs of money that
Hmm.
are just sitting there waiting for them. That had to have been so hard. I don't know if she ever, talked to you about it, but that just the mental gymnastics of that all is quite astounding.
Yeah, it was pretty complex, and so our whole life was funded by my dad's family wealth, essentially. And so she grew up in abundance and in a wealthy community. So that was kind of the life she was used to. And, she was a stay-at-home mom and quickly turned to a single mom and really had to kind of face reality and what that looks like, and working full time and paying the rent and so on. And something I talk about, but we definitely, as kids, like 13, 14, 15, were emailing our trustees for whatever it was, extracurricular activities. And I had horses and rodeo growing up, so that's very expensive. So it was this really weird place to be in, being 13 years old, like emailing a trustee.
Yeah, that is so odd because it's like I have to ask someone else for money who's not
Hmm.
my parent,
Hmm.
and I know I have this money sitting there, and I'm assuming you don't know how much is there, but it's like,
Hmm.
"Hey, can you pay for this activity?" "Yeah, sure, no problem." And then it's just
Yeah.
taken care of, so it's kinda like this magical email that you're
Yeah.
sending, and the money just appears.
Totally. Yeah. And, that's a big part of kind of what the challenges that I started to face and realize was not ever being held accountable for my money mistakes, essentially. So if I like racked up a credit card bill, shopping or doing whatever, it was solved with a simple email. And I never really had to pay the consequences of my money mistakes, essentially. And I always say that the biggest blessing with my inheritance is it's nothing that's gonna carry me through life, at least with the lifestyle that I've been accustomed to and the lifestyle I want to live. Whereas my dad and his siblings were all told that they would never have to work a day in their life. So I think psychologically that really messed him up and messed them up, where I've kind of had this thing in the back of my head of like, I need to figure out something for myself, you know?
I have to ask because I'm sure the listeners are wondering. So this all started from your grandfather marrying a woman, your grandmother, with from family money. How did that family money start?
Yeah. So my great grandmother, it's really an interesting story. They were based out of Chicago, and my great grandmother had an uncle who had created this fortune and created this empire. And he and his wife lost their daughter, their one and only daughter. And then shortly after, both of them passed away, and he left his entire fortune to my great grandmother, who was his niece. And so it's interesting to see how like it kind of shifted
Yeah.
completely, right? And so at 17 years old, my grandmother inherited um, the Texaco fortune, and there's a New York Times paper of her. I can't remember the year, but she's on the cover of the New York Times, or the front page of the New York Times, and she was listed as the wealthiest woman in America, and she was only 17. So
Wow.
it was really a crazy, I can only imagine, crazy situation for them. I know that she had to hire security, and she was getting death threats, and then they're going through the Great Depression, and so really a complex thing. And my great grandmother's husband, partner at the time, he was an illustrator, and he went to illustration school in Chicago, and it was his dream to be an illustrator. And he dropped everything and became the CEO of Texaco and started to take over the family business. So, it really is a whole very interesting story of how it shifted and timeline shifts and all of that.
Wow. Yeah. And then, I mean, at 17, that's unbelievable. But then you, who's guiding you? Because there can only be so many people you trust, because it's like
Right.
everyone you meet from that point thereafter, it's like, what are they trying to get out of me,
What are
kind of
their
thing.
intentions? Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's like, okay, well, my parents, my family, like that's that's it. And
Mhm.
wow. And then at 17. So do are there stories of where there are people that had ill intentions and have taken advantage, and then how is that thread throughout your family of like, who do we trust and all of that?
Yeah. You know, I think that the whole real estate deal that my grandfather had gotten involved in, there was a lot of ill intent with his business partners. And I think he wasn't really fully informed on everything that was going down, clearly. But as far as my experience and the stories I've heard and witnessed myself, I did see it a lot with my dad, going back to him just being really the nicest, funniest, coolest, most humble person in the room always. In my childhood, I really watched people take advantage of him and friends constantly asking to borrow money and never paying him back. And definitely, I can only imagine that there's so many stories that I don't know of. I was pretty young when my grandmother passed away, and I just wish I was born a little earlier so I could have had more conversations with her and learned more from her. But I definitely think that, you know, people coming in with, you know, ill intent or weird intentions has probably definitely been a theme and a thread throughout generations.
So you've always known there's a cushion for you, but it's not everything. So you had that expectation where your father and his sibling didn't have that. It was like, you don't have to worry. Do you know,
Yeah,
was that mathematically true? Because I'll speak to clients and they'll say, well, I need to have X amount of money to retire. And it's like, that may be plenty for you. That may be not enough for someone else. So was that
totally.
mathematically true, what your father and his siblings were hearing, that they didn't have to work ever again? Or was that an unreasonable expectation that was given to them?
Mathematically, yes, it was true. Like they were always going to be taken care of. If my dad was alive today, he would still be getting monthly and quarterly distributions, regardless of what he was spending and what he had access to. It's nothing like super substantial, but certainly something in more than the average, salary in America. So yes, but at the same time, that doesn't mean they didn't or my dad didn't deal with money stresses, because he always would say to us kids, like, let's go burn some money, let's go spend some money, and the thing about my dad is he was the coolest, nicest, funniest, most humble guy you had ever met. Everyone loved him, everyone thought they were his best friend, and he dealt with a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around his money. He didn't understand why one person was struggling on the street without food and he was just given everything. And he grew up in such big money, and they had a plane and an island and two homes and all this stuff, and I think he was a little turned off by all of that. And he was the one of six kids that kind of left his hometown and moved to Colorado and just tried to disconnect from it, but he still really struggled, and he struggled with addiction his entire life. And yeah, so that certainly just because he was told he never had to work a day in his life and he would have been taken care of for the rest of his life doesn't mean he wasn't stressed about money.
Right, because a lot of people assume inheriting money is all about luxury and ease and everything's all good, but you talk about it being disorienting. So
Mhm.
and you're alluding to it already with your father, but what identity challenges come with inherited wealth that people on the outside may not
Mm.
understand?
Yeah. It's such a multi-layered onion and complex, but I would say there's a lot of self-worth issues and not feeling, deserving of it. And also just not having the belief that you can create this for yourself. I think one of my core beliefs that I had to hack early on was this belief that money only came from one place and one place only. And that's actually a scarcity mindset, and I really had to open up to the possibility and opportunities where money could come in elsewhere. And then, another big part of the identity question that you ask is it's a very generational thing. I've seen it range from generation to generation, but with the earlier generations, I see a lot of family expectations and pressure. So, which causes a lot of confusing identity questions and confusion because who are you without, this big family behind you and this money behind you. So, it's complex and brings up all the identity questions.
So, what are some of the inherited money patterns or family dynamics you had to unlearn to build your own voice and your own vision?
I would say, well, kind of going back to what I mentioned about this money block of having this belief that money only came from one place and one place only, and just really having the belief that I can create it myself and I'm capable of that. I talk about generational trauma in my book. It's chapter 3. I have a whole chapter on it, and talking about how regardless of what you see or don't see with generations, it does their decisions and their experiences do affect you. So, for instance, my grandfather, who married into money, all the money had come through the woman in my family. So my grandfather had married into money. And so he was trying to navigate this, like trying to be a man and be the man of the family with my grandma's money. He entered a real estate deal in Chicago in the late 60s, early 70s, and it had a promising ROI and he lost upwards of $30 million that they were never able to recover. So I think that's a big thing that I've had to kind of heal and overcome for my family, really, because when you're talking about generational trauma and healing it, it really only takes one person to break these cycles and address it. And so I would say early on, that was one of the things that I found myself, healing and trying to overcome is this fear of losing. There's actually a medical term called loss aversion, which it means you have a greater fear of losing what you have than having the belief of making more. And I would say that right there is, the answer to your question.
That had to have been so, I mean, difficult doesn't even begin to describe it because I'm sure your grandfather was already feeling sorts of ways about marrying into this family with money. Not sure if
Mhm.
he came from money or not, but not that type of money, right? Even if he
Yeah.
did. So he was probably already feeling a little bit less than, some insecurities, self-doubt, all of those
Yep.
things, not worthy. So then he's trying to kind of make it to contribute. See, I can make these decisions as well. I can grow our wealth. I can do all of these things.
Yep.
And then for it not to pan out had to have been
Yeah.
just like, double whammy. Doesn't even begin to describe probably how he felt with that. So yeah, that
Yeah.
is definitely something that carries through generations and all, and his money issues as a result of it and all of the other dynamics definitely can be passed down to his children and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. All right, Chase, it's time for our money confession segment where I ask you some real deal questions about money and just answer as openly and as honestly as you can. What is a recurring expense you have that you love and others call it ridiculous?
Ooh, great question. I would say it's all of my like personal development stuff, my coaches and coaching programs that I've been involved with. It gets pricey and a lot of people don't understand it.
What is your favorite cheap thrill? Something under $20 that brings you joy every time.
First thing that comes to mind is Dove bar soap. I don't know. I don't know why. That's something that I just like will never not, no matter how much money I have, I'll always use a Dove bar soap.
What was your most memorable money mistake and what did it teach you?
I think it was when I first got an Amex Platinum card and didn't have a limit and went to Beverly Hills and had a shopping spree. and then I had to deal with the repercussions after.
If money were to show up on your doorstep, what would you say to it?
Welcome.
It's wonderful that your grandmother had the foresight to put restrictions when it comes to your trust fund and
Yeah.
say split it up at different ages. It's very smart for obvious reasons. An 18-year-old is going to make very different decisions than a 35-year-old. So that is a gift in itself,
Hmm.
because who knows if you received it all 18, what you would have today. Does your family talk about this? Like, and maybe even like your cousins, if you're all around the same age of, yeah, I'm turning 30 or whatever the next age is
Hmm.
that you receive your windfall. Do you all talk about it and like, yeah, I really screwed up the first time. I hope I don't this
Hmm.
time, or this is my plan, or these are the steps I'm going to take?
Yeah, I would say my siblings and I do. We're extremely close. I think just everything we've been through, losing our dad young and, lots of other traumas from our childhood. We are all extremely close. And, my brother turned 25 this year and received a windfall. So it's always like we're talking about it and all supportive and encouraging. And my two older sisters, there's an age gap, and they've been great role models, and we've kind of been able to follow their lead. I my first kind of big distribution in windfall was 21, and um I just knew I couldn't trust myself with hundreds of thousands of dollars in my checking account. I would have went and bought a G-Wagon or a Range Rover and a bunch of designer clothes. And so there's something in me that just knew I couldn't trust myself with it, and I decided to buy a house. Funny enough, my trustees and financial advisors advised against it. They're in Illinois, where property tax is extremely high and the market isn't, increasing every year like it was where I purchased. Um and intuitively I just knew, and it was the best decision I ever made. I still have the house and it's doubled in value, and I'm a landlord. So yeah, I think I'm grateful for my siblings. And then my cousins, who there is also an age gap where my brother and I are a lot younger. We're the youngest ones. And my cousins blew through their money. I mean, blew through it. And there weren't these restrictions on them. And a big part of why my grandmother put the restrictions in place for us. And so I have open conversations with them too. They always, they're open about it and talk about it and what they would have done differently. But all in all, this is a topic that people don't like to talk about. I really don't talk about it with my aunts and uncles that are still alive, and it's a conversation people don't like to have.
So, what are some of the more common mistakes you see inheritors make with their money? I mean, technically and but also emotionally driven
Yeah.
mistakes.
I would say just having this mindset that like the money's always going to be there and you're always going to be supported. So kind of overindulging and overspending on, day-to-day things that don't hold value. And then I think like logistically speaking, I see a lot of inheritors, and it was somewhat of my experience as well, just really not getting involved with what they have and the investments that they have and what they have and what it's doing and what's coming in, what's going out, because it really is this, as an inheritor, you really don't have to worry about it. It's like I said, like one email solves everything, right? In that moment. And so I would say just not getting involved and not having a true understanding of what you have and what you're doing with it, kind of having a hands-off approach to it. It's something I really encourage my clients to do is, whether you stay with the same advisor that your family's been working with, or you find a new advisor that's more aligned with your values and maybe younger and someone you have a personal relationship can build a personal relationship with, I would say is the best thing to do is really get involved.
You created the trust fund coach and wrote Trust Your Trust Fund to be the guide you didn't have. What are the first steps someone should take if they've just inherited wealth and feel completely lost? And not even just a trust fund, but their parents pass away and they inherit some money. So it doesn't have to be a life-changing amount of money, just any inheritance in general. What would you suggest the first steps be?
The first things first, just stop and take a breath and don't make any rash decisions. Don't change your lifestyle. Don't, upgrade houses or car cars, just really like take a minute to sit with it and don't make any rash decisions. I would then say, if this was a client that I was working with, there would be we would be doing a lot of work around their purpose and their fulfillment and what it is that they actually want to do and how they want to make a difference and how they want to optimize this money. And then, finding a team of people who you can trust and that you can build personal relationships with that are in your corner and have the best intentions for you.
Do you suggest finding your own team, creating your own team, or sticking with the team that your family has used? There could be a age gap, right, between those
Mhm.
that are giving you advice, a location gap, as you mentioned. So, do you think that it's beneficial to create your own team when you inherit any type of money?
For sure. I think it gives you a feeling of independence and control. And and I think it also gives you the opportunity to learn more. I remember being like 19, I was in Chicago and um I was like, I'm gonna meet with the advisors and like, I want to meet them face to face and all this stuff. And I just remember feeling so disconnected from them and almost feeling um and so absolutely I would suggest finding your own team with, doing your diligence and research and kind of educating yourself first, of course, but yeah, absolutely.
You talk about guilt often, and you say
Mhm.
guilt can paralyze inheritors and prevent them from living meaningful lives. How can we work through that? Or how did you personally work through that? And what advice would you give your clients if they're stuck in that guilt loop?
Yeah. I think there's a couple main things that guilt stems from with inheritors. I think it's either like a guilt of overindulging and like overspending, or a guilt of just having the money in itself that you didn't earn and work for. So it would kind of depend on which scenario we're working with. If it's a guilt of overindulgence and overspending, I think it's an easier solution and you just kind of work with a budget and start to be more conscious about what you're doing and what you're spending and your lifestyle. If it's guilt that stems from just having the money and because you just don't deserve it, then that's kind of more of a subconscious belief system that, we have to break down and get to the bottom of and start to look at, what can you do to um, feel more purpose and fulfillment in your day to day life. And who are you called to help? What are you called to do? And how can you do it? Another interesting thing I see with guilt is I see a lot of inheritors giving out of guilt or maybe paying for a bill out of guilt and or donating to a foundation out of guilt, which I just don't recommend. It leaves residual feelings and resentment and I think if you're donating to a foundation or paying for a bill, you should always feel good about it and feel none of those residual feelings.
Yeah, that's as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, people will just say, well, just donate it. Just donate to a
Yeah,
charity then. And that's very empty. That's just a very empty action. If you just write a check to a charity and that's
yeah,
it, it's like you have to maybe donate your time to the charity and really
yeah,
and then get a purpose behind it. And then you may end up never giving any dollars to it and you're giving all of your time to it because the money that you're receiving is allowing you to give back in another way. But
yeah.
a couple months ago when it was the Bezos wedding in Italy,
Mhm.
people were like, I would have done so much more with that money. I would donate it all. And it's like, right, but like, would you? Or, would you? And it's just so easy for people to say, well, just donate it, write a check. And it's like, that might not be filling the hole of what's going on. It could be a
Yeah,
lot deeper than that.
absolutely. And my family has a pretty large foundation that is still standing today and invested super well. And so my siblings and I, because my father passed away, were given, a certain amount of money each year to donate. And I and this isn't necessarily related to guilt, but I did notice such a difference when I was a lot younger, kind of just, like, picking random foundations and, like, not really having any involvement and, um, so donating the money and that versus like donating to a foundation that, I feel aligned with and really compelled to help and, just getting a little more involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, You say that wealth is not an identity, it's a tool. And I say often, and many people do, money is a tool. It doesn't have emotions. It is not good or bad. It just is. So help me unpack that idea and share how you help your clients shift from defining themselves by their wealth to using it with purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down to really just having like a conscious understanding of this concept and being really conscious about what you're doing with it and why you're doing what you're doing with it. I remember being in New York City and, purchasing things that in hindsight just I don't resonate with and but because of like my affluent friends that I was hanging out with in a very similar situation as me, I was almost like forcing this identity that I didn't even align with, And so I think it's taking a serious look at your values and what it is that you want and like what and where do you want to put your money towards, that align more with your values and the identity that you align with or resonate with most.
Your great great grandmother, when she inherited the money, she had to have felt like a tremendous amount of guilt or questioning or, I mean, I'm not even this person's daughter. I'm in their
Mhm.
bloodline, I'm their niece, but I'm not even their daughter.
Mm.
Was there I mean, and you may not know this, but I might be asking this rhetorically, but was there a weird dynamic with that? And also the fact that the siblings of your great great grandmother's uncle weren't the ones that inherited the company or the money, and a
Yeah,
17-year-old did.
right. It's interesting because I don't necessarily have an answer for that. I can only assume that there were very complicated feelings and dynamics that, went on with that. I talk a lot about family dynamics because money does change family dynamics regardless of how close you think you are with someone or how close you think your family is. But yeah, I can only imagine that she felt guilt and the siblings didn't inherit it. She's only 17 and also in a time where so many people are struggling and the Great Depression is happening and or about to happen and happens and then so yeah, absolutely. I can only assume that there were some weird dynamics.
How do you help clients navigate well-meaning but heavy-handed family expectations, especially
Mm.
when trust fund baby becomes a role instead of a person?
It's really interesting how it kind of differs from generation to generation. Most of the time, I see these heavy family expectations in the earlier generations, second and third generations, right? Because a second generation or first generation inheritor um, have watched their parents or grandparents build this empire and hustle and work, right? And so oftentimes the people who have built this empire have these crazy expectations for their kids who they're handing essentially the world to. And so it kind of just depends on the actual situation. If it's a family business that's still in business and happening and they're feeling really pressured to take over the business or work in the business, I find it super helpful to really be intentional about what you're doing in the business or what you're hired for essentially. I've seen so many people be working in a family business and they don't feel aligned with it and they don't feel that it's their calling, but at the same time they have these natural skills and talents and interests that could totally benefit the family business if they were just in a different role, right? So it could be as simple as like shifting roles and shifting that role in a family business. And it
Maybe just also remove the label of, like, the heir apparent, like,
yes.
once you have that slapped on you, no one's going to take you seriously, generally
Yeah.
speaking, especially if
Yeah.
you're put in a high level position immediately. So it's
Yeah.
almost like let me be an intern, let me work through the ranks and feel
Yeah.
like I'm really earning it versus
Yeah.
placing me in something.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tough thing about that situation as well is if you're working in a family business, no matter how hard you work or how hard you don't work, there's going to be stereotypes and assumptions. So you could be the hardest worker, in the company, but you're still going to be discredited and people are still going to talk about it and have their own feelings about it and thoughts. So it really is a weird, tricky place to be because you could be the hardest worker or the least hardest worker, and it's going to be the same talk throughout the office or company.
I'm picturing a TV show like, Undercover Boss. It's like undercover
Yes,
beneficiary and like throughout the years of how this person's worked and go by a different name and then let
totally.
them take over and see the difference in reactions by the other
Yeah.
employees of the business.
I actually just recently wrote a blog about this a few weeks ago, and it was about the In and Out and Air, Lindsay
Uh-huh.
Snyder. And I don't know if you're familiar with her story, but she did exactly that. She went and waited 2 hours in a line to interview at an In and Out at 17 years old, and she worked every single position for I think 3 years, and it was just something she wanted to do, and not one person knew that she was going to inherit the entire thing. And so it's a very fascinating story, and she's a very fascinating woman.
That's really,
Hmm.
really cool.
Yeah.
So, as we're wrapping up, for someone who's listening right now who's quietly overwhelmed by the pressure of inherited wealth, maybe feeling shame or afraid to speak up or talk to their family members, talk to anyone else that can understand, what's one thing you want them to know?
Well, that you're not alone and that you're not nothing's wrong with you for feeling any of these feelings or complications around inherited wealth. And I would encourage them to open up the conversation with, a trusted family member or friend that they know that isn't going to have any judgment or, probably someone that's close with them. Don't be afraid to speak up. I was so afraid to speak up and it's really freed me a lot to just talk about it.
Here's what I hope this conversation with Chase reminded you. Money doesn't cancel out pain. It doesn't erase identity struggles. And it absolutely does not guarantee confidence, clarity, or emotional freedom. Whether you've grown up with money or without it, there's always emotional work to do. And inherited wealth comes with its own heavy backpack. But Chase's story shows us something really powerful. You can rewrite the narrative. You can use wealth with intention and not guilt. You can stop being defined by your trust fund or your trauma and start defining yourselves by your values. So if you're sitting on an inheritance or simply feeling overwhelmed by the money you do have, remember this. You are not alone and you don't have to carry it all by yourself. If you found this episode eye opening, share it with a friend who needs to hear it, especially the ones who are quietly holding on to more than they let on. And before you go, be sure to follow the show so you never miss an episode. Leave a quick 5-star rating and review. It helps us reach more listeners like you. And keep the conversation going with me on Instagram at Everyone's Talking Money. And remember, money should be a tool to live life on your terms, not a burden, and definitely not your entire identity. I'll see you next time.